Part 1. The History of Imperialism, a Personal Perspective. But, if constructing the future and settling everything for all times are not our affair, it is all the more clear what we have to accomplish at present. I am referring to ruthless criticism of all that exists. Ruthless both in the sense of not being afraid of the results it arrives at and in the sense of being just as little afraid of the conflict with the powers that be. In that case, we do not confront the world in a doctrinaire way with a new principle. Here is the truth, kneel down before it. We develop new principles for the world out of the world's own principles. We do not say to the world, cease your struggles, they are foolish, we will give you the true slogan of the struggle. We merely show the world what it is really fighting for, and consciousness is something that it has to acquire, even if it does not want to. Letter from Marx to Rouge, September 1843. Chapter 1. The Emergence of a Divided World. Colonization and Capitalism. Let us begin with the breakthrough of capitalism and colonialism. It structured the world we still live in and established the norms we still live by today. If we need to name a year to indicate the birth of the capitalist world system, then 1492 is as good a choice as any. In 1492, the European powers, as a result of Columbus's search for a sea passage to India, began their military, economic, political, and cultural conquest of the world. In Europe itself, capitalism began to replace feudalism. The histories of colonialism and capitalism are inseparable. Capitalism has always had a global dimension. Between the years 1000 and 1500, the world was divided into three blocks. China and India were economically and politically most advanced. The Middle East focused on trade and served as a transport hub, and Europe was part of the periphery. The Asiatic mode of production was more varied, more effective, and technologically superior to anything that had been developed in Europe. Asia was home to the most powerful civilizations and the most sophisticated state systems in the world. This remained the case until the 18th century. Asia had even seen rudimentary forms of capitalism emerge, for example during China's Song dynasty or in the Arab-Persian Abbasid Caliphate. As trade intensified, the exchange value of commodities became more important than their use value. In Europe, the Italian city-states developed foreign trade and advanced banking and finance systems in the 15th century. But it was between London, Paris, and Amsterdam that European capitalism first emerged, and from where it has since expanded to the last corners of the world. The early expansion of European capitalism was largely based on military power, naval power in particular. The seafaring nations of Spain and Portugal played pivotal roles. If the ruling classes of Europe could not conquer the East politically, they at least wanted to control economic relations. That's why they were looking for new trade routes across the Atlantic. Columbus believed until his death that the Americas belonged to the Asian continent. With the conquest of the so-called New World and the plunder of its riches, European capitalism gained momentum. The most important products yielded by the Spanish colonies in Latin America were silver and gold. Europe, eager to expand its trade, yearned after them, and European princes, kings, aristocrats, and clerics were insatiable. A new European bourgeoisie and a growing number of civil servants demanded overseas commodities. Gold and silver were the preferred means of exchange, and their limited availability was an obstacle to the circulation of goods now demanded by many. Enormous amounts of these two precious metals were taken from Latin America, especially from Mexico and Peru. In Spain, they were turned into coins that spread across Europe, satisfying capitalism's need for growth. Gold and silver coins strengthened inter-European trade and made it possible to import goods from Asia. At the time, Europe had no goods to offer that would have been of any interest to Asian traders. As Leo Huberman, co-founder of Monthly Review, has written, the Spanish mint turned out only 45,000 kilograms of silver in the period from 1500 to 1520. But for the 15-year period from 1545 to 1560 its production increased 6 times, to 270,000 kilograms. And the 20-year period from 1580 to 1600 saw production leap to 340,000 kilograms, almost 8 times what it had been in 1520. Did this huge supply of silver which was brought from America to Spain stay in Spain? Not at all. It circulated all over Europe as fast as it poured in. To paraphrase Andre Gunder Frank, in capitalism's earliest phase, it was not Europe that shaped the world, but the world that shaped Europe. The global hegemony of European capitalism was still a long ways off. Portuguese and, especially, Spanish colonialism were not based on strong merchant capital, but on enormous royal power. This explains why Portuguese and Spanish colonial rule were characterized by violent conquest and plundering rather than trade. The Portuguese and Spanish simply didn't have much to trade with. The Arab traders who they met along the east coast of Africa were not interested in doing business with them. They were already engaged in lucrative trade with people from the Arab Gulf, India, and Africa. But what the Portuguese and Spanish couldn't get by way of commodities, they got by way of cannons. The Arab traders had nothing with which to counter those. It was the power of their arms that opened the global market to the Europeans. The European powers were experienced in warfare, feudalism was characterized by violent conflict, and the art of war and related technologies were well developed. No military power outside of Europe, save, perhaps, the Ottoman Empire, could compete. It was Portuguese artillery that created Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean, and it was Spanish armor and swords that crushed the Incas and Mayans in America. Portugal and Spain's colonizing expeditions in the early 16th century were driven by the feudal desire for luxury. Big profits were made by sending off well-armed expeditions that returned with lucrative plunder. Early Portuguese and Spanish colonialism was feudal rather than capitalist. But the interest of other European powers in trading with Africa, India, and soon also America grew rapidly. The Portuguese and Spanish did not profit from this. They had used their gold and silver to buy commodities produced in England, France, Germany, and the Netherlands, boosting manufacturing in those countries but not at home. While Portugal and Spain remained stuck in feudalism, capitalism advanced quickly in other parts of Europe. It is no coincidence that churches and palaces in Portugal and Spain are so opulent. Aristocrats, knights, civil servants, and priests defined one end of society, and beggars the other. As Portugal and Spain became increasingly dependent on the import of consumer goods and foodstuffs and their expenses in the colonies grew, they lost their leading role in the global expansion of European might. A new central force had emerged, Dutch merchant capital. The ideological expression of this transformation was a religious conflict. Max Weber's theory about capitalism being a consequence of Protestantism is well known, but it is false. Rather, Protestantism was a consequence of capitalism. When early capitalism challenged the feudal mode of production, it also challenged its ideological underpinnings. The metaphysics of the Middle Ages were replaced by modern philosophy and science. The ideological expression of feudalism was Catholicism. Therefore, anti-feudal forces had to challenge Catholicism. This gave rise to the Protestant movement. In 1517, Martin Luther nailed his anti-Catholic theses onto the wooden door of a church in Wittenberg, Germany. Only a few years later, Europe was engulfed by violent religious conflict. The Reformation in Germany was the first major ideological attack by the bourgeoisie against the feudal powers. It was easy to find followers among townspeople, the lower aristocracy, and peasants. They all had reasons to rebel against the Catholic Church. The first uprising, in 1523, was led by the lower aristocracy, the second, in 1525, by peasants. Both were crushed, but the Protestant movement did not die. When John Calvin became its figurehead, it increased in strength. Calvin's teachings were more political than Luther's. He explicitly supported republicanism, and the values he taught corresponded to the ambitions of the bourgeoisie. Entrepreneurism and thriftiness were praised, science was regarded as a source of progress, and the administration of the state and the justice system were to be separated from religion. The political dimension of Calvinism was particularly pronounced in the Netherlands, where it was embraced by bourgeois merchants. In the Netherlands, Calvinism also had a clear nationalist bent, with the Dutch provinces demanding secession from Spain. The Spaniards tried to crush the rebellion with the help of soldiers and the Inquisition. Entire towns were put under siege and massacred. But the Dutch were able to resist, not least because they received the support of 6,000 English soldiers, which, in turn, drew the Pope's ire. He considered Queen Elizabeth to be a heretic. Spain tried to attack England, but its armada of 130 ships carrying 30,000 troops suffered a devastating defeat in the English Channel. The battle marked the end of Spain as the world's major naval power and the emergence of the Netherlands as the driving force of global capitalist expansion. By the mid-17th century, the Netherlands had a trading fleet greater than those of England and France combined. Slavery. The rise of merchant capitalism did not imply a complete neglect of manufacturing. The institutionalization of slavery confirms this. After the Spanish and Portuguese had taken most of the easily accessible metals in their American colonies, they were forced to dig underground. Indigenous people were forced to work in the mines and fields, but they were difficult to control and many died from hard labor and European diseases such as smallpox. Their cultures were under assault and their numbers dwindled rapidly. The Incas and Aztecs had established advanced centralized societies with irrigation systems and well-organized production and distribution of foods. Now, there was famine. Eventually, the indigenous population of the territories under Spanish and Portuguese control was brought to the brink of extinction. From about 50 million in 1492, it had fallen to 4 million by the end of the 17th century. In 1519, Mexico's population was estimated to be 25 million people. By 1605, there were 1.25 million left. For the colonizers, this mainly meant a lack of local labor. They responded by importing African slaves. At first, the Portuguese captured slaves in attacks along the West African coast. Later, they obtained slaves by trading European goods with powerful locals who delivered the cargo directly to the ports. Other European countries followed suit. England, France, the Netherlands, and Denmark all entered the slave trade. Slaving posts were established from Senegal in the north to Angola in the south. Soon, it became necessary to push deeper into the continent to satisfy the growing colonial need for manpower. Europeans instigated conflicts between African societies, trading clothes and, especially, weapons for slaves with either side. What is known today as tribalism was a product of European colonialism. While the hunt for gold and silver destroyed the societies of the Americas, the hunt for slaves destroyed those of Africa. This was not only about the loss of life. The manufactured goods that Europeans traded for slaves undermined local craftsmanship and commerce. Entire societies were displaced, fleeing from slave hunters. The human toll was enormous. 10 to 12 million African slaves reached American shores. It has been estimated that for each slave sold on American soil, 4 had been captured in Africa. This means that about 30 million Africans died during the voyage. Millions also died from European diseases and in conflicts instigated by the colonists. Africa's population did not increase between 1450 and 1870. In the 16th and 17th centuries, most slaves in the Americas worked in Portuguese and Spanish mines, especially in the silver mines of Brazil. However, by the end of the 17th century, the cultivation of exotic crops and plantation agriculture were becoming increasingly important. The English had started to cultivate sugarcane in Barbados around the year 1650. Before that, the only sweetener available in Europe was honey. Sugar was so valuable that it was sold in grams. It took only a few decades, however, for it to become a regular item in European households and one of the most valued colonial goods. In 1643, there were about 5,000 African slaves in Barbados. In 1664, subsistence farming was basically eradicated and 800 sugar plantations had been established. Half of the early European colonizers had left and the number of slaves had risen to 40,000. The situation was the same on almost all of the Caribbean islands. At the height of the slave trade in the late 18th century, the ratio between colonists and slaves in the British West Indies was 1:10, in the French West Indies 1:14, and in the Dutch West Indies 1:24. Tobacco, coffee, and cacao were sown and harvested by slaves. These new luxuries required little manufacturing and became the final piece in the triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and America. Ships from Europe brought manufactured goods such as clothes, weapons, ammunition, and alcohol to the shores of Africa, where they were exchanged for slaves, who were then shipped to America and sold to plantation owners who paid in sugar, tobacco, coffee, indigo, cotton, and other goods that were returned to Europe for enormous profits. The number of workers on the plantations and haciendas of the colonies and in their factories and mines was at least equal to the number of proletarians in Europe. Africa was not yet properly colonized during this period. It was still mainly used as a supplier of labor, and Europeans were mainly present at trading posts along the coast. Colonization gained momentum when, in addition to the trading posts primarily dealing in slaves, Europeans required supply stations for merchant ships traveling to Asia and back. The Dutch Cape Colony, at the southern tip of the continent, was of great importance not only for Dutch but also for English trade, important enough for the English to take possession of it in the early 1800s. More and more European settlers arrived in southern Africa and some manufacturing was established. There were still few Europeans, however, who ventured further into the rest of the continent. Capturing slaves along the West African coast became increasingly difficult in the late 18th century. The brutality of the slave trade had caused such havoc that many of the societies affected by it had simply disappeared. Furthermore, the British were keen on absorbing Africa into their empire as a supplier of raw materials and minerals. As a consequence, the British bourgeoisie outlawed the slave trade in 1806. This did not mean an end to slavery as such, as plantation owners developed schemes to reproduce the slave population that already existed in the West Indies and the southern colonies of North America. The emergence of a world market meant a division of the world into a center and a periphery. We have already mentioned the devastating effects that this had for the indigenous people of America and Africa. In Asia, the Dutch took possession of Indonesia and the British of India. Colonization was fundamentally based on violence and military might. The Europeans met fierce resistance, however, and often had to pay a high price. Increasingly, they resorted to alliances with local leaders who would serve European interests while leaving local cultures and power structures largely intact. Dutch merchant capitalism. The Dutch trading empire was based on the country's historical role as a center of commerce, its highly developed manufacturing, and the absence of stifling feudal structures. In the 14th century, Bruges had been the most important trading center in northern Europe. It was Antwerp, however, that was key for early Dutch merchant capital, as it lacked Bruges's restrictive guilds. Visitors to the Antwerp Stock Exchange were greeted by the words, "Open for traders from all nations." Antwerp also remained in good standing with Spain, where most of the money came from. Only when Dutch merchant capital expanded across the world did its center of gravity shift from Antwerp to Amsterdam. Manufacturing developed early in the Netherlands. Textile manufacturing has a rich tradition in Flanders, which experienced a strong economic boom in the 17th century. But there were also highly developed paper manufacturers and shipyards which required a high concentration of capital. First and foremost, however, the Netherlands was a trading nation. As in other important trading nations, international trading companies were founded in the late 16th century. The Dutch were particularly eager to strengthen their influence in the Caribbean and the Indonesian archipelago. The two most important trading companies were therefore the Dutch West India Company and the Dutch East India Company. The latter developed into one of the most important trading companies to shape the colonial system. Apart from taking possession of important East Asian islands such as the Moluccas, Java, and Sumatra, it also established control over Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, and Cape Town in southern Africa. The company became known for two things, its brutality and its enormous profits. Merchant capital united formerly isolated economies and cultures in a world system. The Netherlands, England, and France divided the non-European world between themselves. Each power demanded its own territories to exploit and trade with. Commercial outposts were established to monopolize trading routes. Navy ships, fortified ports, and agreements with local rulers kept merchants from competing nations away. This was not a smooth process. Colonization was characterized by numerous trade wars between the colonial powers themselves. While trading colonies were characteristic of the colonization of Africa and Asia, colonialism in the Americas was different. The American colonies were settler colonies, where Europeans came and stayed. The economies of these colonies were often based on plantation agriculture and slavery, the sugar industry of the Caribbean being a prime example. Settler colonies were very profitable for European merchants. At the same time, some settler colonies in North America were different. They were not based on plantation agriculture, but on small-scale farming and modest manufacturing. These colonies were of no particular interest to merchant capital, since they didn't promise any profits. Eventually, they become rivals. A key aspect of capitalist development during the golden age of Dutch merchant capitalism was the establishment of national financial systems. With the growing importance of the state as a protector of international trade, military expenses, especially for navy fleets, increased significantly. They were covered by both domestic and foreign loans. This, in turn, affected taxation. Private banks and financial systems expanded at the same time, hoping to reap profits. The Bank of Amsterdam became a powerful symbol for the Netherlands' global economic power. During the heyday of the Dutch trading nation, merchant capital was capital's dominant form. Plunder and trade of colonial goods turned money into more money. Merchant capitalism's distinguishing feature was that production was not the basis of capitalist development. Merchant capital was trading between societies in which the capitalist mode of production had not yet developed. It was by trade that goods became commodities. This is why the laws of value and price formation do not apply to merchant capitalism. The only law for merchant capitalism was to buy cheap and to sell dear. But as merchant capital developed, the law of value became ever more relevant. Territories that had formerly only exchanged natural surplus were now used as sites of production. Exchange value had replaced use value. Karl Marx, the development of commerce and merchants' capital gives rise everywhere to the tendency towards production of exchange values, increases its volume, multiplies it, makes it cosmopolitan, and develops money into world money. Commerce, therefore, has a more or less dissolving influence everywhere on the producing organization, which it finds at hand and whose different forms are mainly carried on with a view to use value. The laws of the market now extended to the production of agricultural goods and to manufacturers in Europe, which implied a growing labor market. In merchant capitalism, the formula of accumulation is money, more money. In productive capitalism, money has been turned into capital, and the formula of accumulation is capital, production, more capital. With its developed manufacturing, colonial possessions, national financial system, modern taxation, advanced banking, private property rights, and a relatively strong separation of church and state, Dutch merchant capitalism prepared the requirements necessary for industrial capitalism to bloom. But it wasn't the Dutch who would take this step. The Dutch bourgeoisie never became a proper industrial bourgeoisie. The Netherlands remained under the control of a strong merchant oligarchy, which prevented the centralization of state power. The merchants guarded the independence of their trading towns jealously. A decentralized state served merchant capitalism well, but it was an obstacle to the development of industrial capitalism, or of capitalism proper. Dutch merchant capitalism declined by the end of the 17th century. It had reached its historical limits. Although there was a certain level of industrial development in the Netherlands with well-established manufacturing, the country was no longer in a position to dominate capitalism globally. Its golden age was over. Dutch capitalists now invested in English stocks. They had become speculators. England as a global power. In early 18th century England, the conditions were just right for the transition to industrial capitalism. The feudal mode of production was in disarray, peasants driven from their lands were filling the ranks of the proletariat, manufacturing was well organized and productive, and the industrial bourgeoisie was a powerful class. Challenging the Netherlands' dominance in trade not only allowed for the further development of the capitalist mode of production, it made it utterly necessary. Throughout the 18th century, the last remnants of feudalism were discarded. Capitalist agriculture replaced feudal agriculture and put an end to small-scale farming. Agricultural production was centralized and intensified with the help of new technologies. It produced the foods required by the growing urban population as well as raw materials for the boom in manufacturing. Manufacturing was replacing craftsmanship, not only in the towns but in the countryside as well. Production was now divided into several tasks, each done by specialized workers and supervised by central management. Many small producers who had started out with modest capital joined the class of powerful industrial capitalists. The domestic market and commodity production were in full bloom. The breakthrough of industrial capitalism in England required a strong, centralized state. This was initially provided by an absolutist monarchy, later by the bourgeois parliament. The absolutist state lasted as long as it was necessary for dissolving feudalism. The bourgeois forces needed time to consolidate and pose a political challenge to the monarch. When they did, the royal family tried to forge an alliance with the remaining feudal lords, but by that point absolutism had become an obstacle to capitalist development. The absolute rule of the monarch was ended by a civil war and a bourgeois parliament was convened in 1689. The new ruling class of England consisted of rich and powerful merchants, capitalist landowners, and the nascent industrial bourgeoisie. The strong bourgeois state made it possible to challenge Dutch control of global trade. England entered into fierce competition with France, which also had a strong centralized state and was actively looking for colonies. But merchant capital in France was weaker than in the Netherlands and England. While it had trading colonies in South India as well as settler colonies in North America and the West Indies, the number of French settlers was modest compared with the English, and neither agriculture nor manufacturing were particularly productive in France's colonies. While the Dutch possessed strong merchant capital but weak state power, the French possessed strong state power but weak merchant capital. The English had both. English trading companies established early colonial outposts in Asia, mainly in India, and in Africa, mainly along the west coast, but their focus lay in the Americas where they established three types of colonies: plantation colonies on the islands of the West Indies, producing sugar, a plantation colony, Virginia, on the American mainland, producing tobacco and cotton, and the settler colony of New England. The motive for establishing plantation colonies was obvious: there were fortunes to be earned in Europe with tropical agricultural products. The motive for the settler colony of New England, however, was of a more political nature. At the beginning of the 17th century, it was widely believed that England was threatened by overpopulation. The solution was immigration to the colonies. The English Civil War, the dislocation of peasants, and the dramatic social changes in the country had brought poverty and political as well as religious persecution. Many Englishmen were ready to resettle in the Americas where they had unlimited access to what seemed in such short supply at home, land. Compared with France, England not only had more settlers in their colonies, but also more active trading companies. The French trading companies were much more closely controlled by the state, which also meant that the French government had to be more involved in its colonies. During armed conflicts in North America, for example, French government troops usually faced armies comprised of English settlers. In 1651, the Navigation Act was passed by the English Parliament. Among other things, it stipulated that no commodities were to be shipped to or from English colonies by foreign ships. Since the English Navy was strong enough to enforce the rule, not least against the threat of Dutch, French, and North African pirates, this meant a further boost to English trade. Naval power was a crucial element of England's imperial politics. The numerous military conflicts between the Netherlands, France, and England around 1700 testified to the fierce rivalry over colonies and trade monopolies at the time. When the Peace of Utrecht was signed in 1713, England was the only true winner. The Spanish ceded Gibraltar and slave trading rights in Latin America, while the French were forced to give up large areas in North America, namely Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Hudson's Bay. England's colonization of India. England now set its sights on the East. It would still be centuries before Europeans would dare challenge the power of the Chinese emperor. India seemed easier prey. At the beginning of the 17th century, India was still more powerful than England, both economically and militarily, but it was politically fragmented. The East India Company established important trading colonies in Madras, 1639, Bombay, Mumbai, 1662, and Calcutta, Kolkata, 1690, and had established a significant presence in India by the end of the century. India was divided into several kingdoms. The economy was based on small, self-sufficient towns which dealt in agricultural products and handicrafts. The royalty lived off tributes and, in return, provided infrastructure such as irrigation systems as well as military protection. India has always been a nation of commerce. Long before Europeans arrived in the country, Indians were trading with other regions in Asia and along the East African coast. There was developed manufacturing, particularly of cotton clothes and textiles. When the Europeans arrived in the 17th century, what they found was anything but a poor or undeveloped society. At first, the English mainly used their Indian trading colonies to export Indian goods to Europe and North America. Of primary interest were finished goods such as cotton clothes and silk. Merchants paid for these with silver and gold. Europeans had few goods of interest to Indians. The result was an accumulation of silver and gold in India, which, in turn, stimulated craftsmanship and manufacturing even more. In 1715, Europeans started to import tea from China. This marked the beginning of a new chapter in the colonization of Asia. The Dutch had lost their possessions along the south coast of India, and it was the English and the French who fought over the most lucrative trade in the region. An English victory was never in doubt. With bases in Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta, it was easy to control the relevant sea passages. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 ensured that France would no longer play any role in the colonization of the Indian subcontinent. During the conflict with France, English policies in India changed. The English were no longer satisfied just trading with the Indians, they wanted to gain control over local production. This shift cannot be understood without considering the interests of England's clothing manufacturers. Clothes imported from India were competitive on the European market. The protectionist tariffs introduced in England at the beginning of the 18th century were an initial response to this. Attempts to force Indians to export raw materials, mainly silk and cotton, rather than finished goods failed, since the English trading companies lacked political influence. There was only one solution: India had to be conquered. The English conquest of India began in the mid-18th century. With a ferocity that can only be compared to the Spanish conquest of South America 250 years earlier, the East India Company went to war with the Indian states. Bengal, the most highly developed and wealthiest of these, was first in line. The Bengali army suffered a critical defeat at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. As a result, the East India Company gained control over all of northeastern India. Bengal had benefited from trading with the English and had grown rich. Now, however, the state was systematically ruined. Its treasury was emptied with tons of gold being shipped to England and many of its riches disappearing into the pockets of East India Company employees. The English introduced outrageously high taxes. Within a few years, Bengal's infrastructure was in tatters and its population brought to the brink of extinction. In 1770 alone, 1/3 of the people living in Bengal starved to death. That same year, the East India Company enjoyed record profits. In 1773, the East India Company was placed under the direct control of the British Parliament, represented in India by a colonial council based in Calcutta. This was the first step in transferring political power in the colonies from the trading companies to the state. From this point on, there would be a stricter distinction between, on the one hand, political and military control exercised by the state, and, on the other, economic control exercised by private companies. For India, the Battle of Plassey marked the beginning of its decline. For England, it marked the beginning of colossal economic progress. The enormous riches that the East India Company's plunder of Bengal had bestowed upon England served to finance the Industrial Revolution. Europe built itself by climbing up on Asian shoulders. Historian Brooke Adams described the process, the influx of Indian treasure, by adding considerably to the nation's cash capital, not only increased its stock of energy, but added much to its flexibility and the rapidity of its movement. Very soon after Plassey, the Bengal plunder began to arrive in London, and the effect appears to have been instantaneous, for all authorities agree that the Industrial Revolution began with the year 1770. Plassey was fought in 1757, and probably nothing has ever equaled the rapidity of the change that followed. In 1760 the flying shuttle appeared, and coal began to replace wood in smelting. In 1764 Hargreaves invented the spinning jenny, in 1776 Grompton contrived the mule, in 1785 Cartwright patented the power loom, and in 1768 Watt matured the steam engine. But though these machines served as outlets for the accelerating movements of the time, they did not cause the acceleration. In themselves inventions are passive, waiting for a sufficient store of force to have accumulated to set them working. That store must always take the shape of money, and money not hoarded but in motion. Before the influx of the Indian treasure, and the expansion of credit which followed, no force sufficient for this purpose existed. Possibly since the world began, no investment has ever yielded the profit reaped from the Indian plunder, because for nearly 50 years Great Britain stood without a competitor. English industrial capitalism. With the help of settlers, mainly expropriated farmers and craftsmen from England, trading companies, and, most importantly, military might, England established itself as the world's leading colonial power. It had a solid footing in all of the economically and strategically most important regions. In the West Indies, where the sugar colonies were under direct control of the trading companies. On the North American mainland, with its plantation and settler colonies, in West Africa, where slaving posts had been established, and in India, whose trade England now controlled. Luxury items such as tea, coffee, tobacco, rum, and sugar helped English merchant capital to amass enormous riches. England continued where the Netherlands had left off, cementing European power across the globe and dividing the world into two parts, the one exploiting, the other exploited. The colonies existed to serve the needs of the motherland. This also meant that, wherever the settlers were strong enough, they tried to get rid of the motherland. In North America, the settlers seceded from England in 1776. Most important for the development of the capitalist world system, however, was the ever-growing capitalist character of colonization. In England, powerful manufacturers made the government prohibit the import of finished goods which might compete with their own products on the domestic market. By the mid-18th century, Indian clothes were banned from Europe. The market for English textile goods expanded. The colony's role was to supply raw materials. This meant that, instead of competing with goods produced in England, they provided the necessary materials for those goods, while at the same time being turned into overseas markets for them. The conditions for capitalism's rise could not have been better. What followed was one of the most violent and radical transformations in human history, the arrival of big industry. Marx summed up the process in the first volume of Capital, the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement and entombment in mines of the aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of blackskins, signalized the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings are the chief momenta of primitive accumulation. On their heels treads the commercial war of the European nations, with the globe for a theater. The different momenta of primitive accumulation distribute themselves now, more or less in chronological order, particularly over Spain, Portugal, Holland, France, and England. In England at the end of the 17th century, they arrive at a systematical combination, embracing the colonies, the national debt, the modern mode of taxation, and the protectionist system. These methods depend in part on brute force, e.g., the colonial system. But they all employ the power of the state, the concentrated and organized force of society, to hasten, hothouse fashion, the process of transformation of the feudal mode of production into the capitalist mode, and to shorten the transition. Force is the midwife of every old society pregnant with a new one. It is itself an economic power. England became the world's leading industrial producer, distributing its goods around the world with the help of the English Navy. Throughout the first half of the 19th century, England had both a monopoly on industrial production and on international trade. Its industrial goods were cheaper than anything produced by traditional craftsmen, both domestically and abroad. England could sell whatever it produced. But not for long. Production and demand. English capitalism experienced its first crisis in the 1840s. Consumption couldn't keep up with production. Establishing a market with enough purchasing power is the single biggest challenge for a capitalist economy. In order to maximize profits, capital needs to expand production, introduce new technologies, and provide the market with an ever-increasing quantity of goods. If the market does not grow, there is stagnation. Marx wrote, "Overproduction is specifically conditioned by the general law of the production of capital, to produce to the limit set by the productive forces, that is to say, to exploit the maximum amount of labor with the given amount of capital, without any consideration for the actual limits of the market or the needs backed by the ability to pay." Mainstream liberal economists have always assumed a balance between production and consumption. For them, a crisis of capitalism never has anything to do with the structure of capitalism itself. In 1803, J.B. Say presented the thesis that production, by way of wages and profits, always creates a purchasing power that corresponds to the total price of all goods produced. History and practical experience, however, show that, with the exception of extreme situations caused by war or natural catastrophe, markets are always dependent on what the buyers can pay for. At first glance, Say's thesis seems logical. Let's take the production of a profitable company as an example. The share of the total price of all goods on the market that has been spent on raw materials, auxiliary materials, machines, factories, etc., can secure significant purchasing power for the finished goods before they are even finished. Wages paid and profits made by suppliers create demand. The workers producing the goods can have their share of the finished product. All this does indeed seem to guarantee a balance between production and purchasing power. The problem, however, lies in the capitalist's profits. They are not available until all goods are sold, which affects purchasing power. Purchasing power is therefore always a step behind supply. There is no balance. This is confirmed by the simple fact that you can always get goods for your money, but not always money for your goods. Purchasing power is also limited by the exploitation necessary for capitalist growth. On the one hand, the capitalist needs to keep wages as low as possible in order to make the biggest profits possible. On the other hand, wages make up a significant part of the purchasing power that is required to generate profit. In other words, the capitalist form of accumulation has a tendency to destroy its own market. If capitalists increase wages, their profits decrease. If they decrease wages, their markets decrease. In both cases, capitalists become hesitant to invest, not because they can't produce, but because they don't know if what they produce can be sold. These structural problems of capitalism came to the surface in England during the first half of the 19th century. Capitalists could not meet the workers' demands for higher wages and better working conditions if they wanted to keep their profit rates intact. The English bourgeoisie could not afford full suffrage and trade unions because it would have threatened capitalism's entire existence at the time. This is why Marx opened the Communist Manifesto in 1848 with the words, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism." But, just around that time, capitalism found a solution to its first major crisis. The productive forces underwent a revolution with the introduction of spinning and weaving machines, the steam engine, and railways. Productivity increased multifold. This, however, did not bring better conditions for the working class. On the contrary, the 1840s became known as the Hungry Forties, as millions suffered from starvation all across Europe. During the Great Famine in Ireland, which lasted from 1845 to 1852, roughly 1 million people died of hunger and related diseases. The famine was not caused by the plant disease that wiped out the potato crop. Potatoes accounted for no more than 20% of the country's agricultural production. During the famine, Ireland was exporting sufficient quantities of corn, wheat, barley, and oats to England, feeding an estimated 2 million people there. It is simply that Ireland was a food-producing colony, similar to India and the sugar islands of the Caribbean, and its population had to suffer the consequences. But misery was not limited to the colonies. In his 1845 book The Condition of the Working Class in England, Friedrich Engels described the terrible conditions in industrial towns. Many English proletarians emigrated to North America, Australia, New Zealand, or one of the other English colonies. As did the proletarians of Ireland, over 1 million left during the Great Famine alone. In the first half of the 19th century, workers' wages in England covered the bare essentials necessary for survival. This weakened the domestic market. Internationally, the rapid industrialization of France and the Americas troubled the English. Traditional craftsmanship was no longer the main competition to English industry, foreign rivals were. Competition among English capitalists also grew. Worst of all was the recurring problem of stagnant consumption vis-a-vis ever-expanding production. The English industrialists' profit rates were falling. One of the ways in which a capitalist country can solve the problem of overproduction is to sell as much as possible on the world market. Marx wrote, "The more capitalistic production develops, the more it is forced to produce on a scale which has nothing to do with the immediate demand but depends on the constant expansion of the world market." A positive trade balance is crucial for a healthy national economy, since the export surplus provides the purchasing power needed to keep domestic supply and demand in balance. However, this cannot be done without hurting other countries. English capital set out to find new markets and possibilities for foreign investment. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx describes this early tendency to globalization. The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. The bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most barbarian, nations into civilization. The cheap prices of its commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls, with which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. It compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, i.e., to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a world after its own image. Marx saw capitalism's development as a centrifugal process. The lower the possibilities became for profitable investment in the most developed capitalist countries, the more important profitable investments in the colonies and the less developed capitalist countries became. Marx predicted that capitalism would spread quickly across the globe. He did not predict that this process would, with equal speed, divide the world into a highly developed imperialist center on the one hand, and an exploited and underdeveloped periphery on the other. When Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, he viewed colonialism as a progressive phenomenon. He believed that English capital would venture far and wide and turn the rest of the world into a mirror image of England. In Capital, he wrote, "The country that is more developed industrially only shows, to the less developed, the image of its own future." The first phase of industrialization ended in England around 1830, when industrialization had barely started in the countries of continental Europe and in the USA. The European countries and the US, however, never turned into a periphery. English capital helped them to become developed capitalist countries themselves. So far, Marx's predictions were correct. By about 1880, the industrial development of both Germany and the USA had surpassed that of England. Marx believed that a similar process was awaiting the colonies of Asia and Africa. Once England had erased the traditional social structures and introduced capitalism, the colonies would undergo a rapid development echoing that of the motherland. About England's role in India, Marx wrote, "England has to fulfill a double mission in India, one destructive, the other regenerating, the annihilation of old Asiatic society, and the laying of the material foundations of Western society in Asia. I know that the English malacracy intend to endow India with railways with the exclusive view of extracting at diminished expenses the cotton and other raw materials for their manufactures. But when you have once introduced machinery into the locomotion of a country which possesses iron and coals, you are unable to withhold it from its fabrication. You cannot maintain a net of railways over an immense country without introducing all those industrial processes necessary to meet the immediate and current wants of railway locomotion, and out of which there must grow the application of machinery to those branches of industry not immediately connected with railways. The railway system will therefore become, in India, truly the forerunner of modern industry. According to this view, the opening of new markets in Africa and Asia, and the export of capital to the Americas, promised to temporarily postpone capitalism's imminent collapse. But the relief wouldn't last long. The eventual result of such an expansion of capitalism would only be more accumulation and a new, even worse, crisis of overproduction. Friedrich Engels predicted the following regarding capitalism's development: even in quite barbarous lands, the bourgeoisie is advancing. What of all the glorious advances of civilization in such lands as Turkey, Egypt, Tunis, Persia, and other barbarous countries? They are nothing else but a preparation for the advent of a future bourgeoisie. Wherever we look, the bourgeoisie are making stupendous progress. They are holding their heads high and haughtily challenge their enemies. They expect a decisive victory, and their hopes will not be disappointed. They intend to shape the whole world according to their standard, and, on a considerable portion of the earth's surface, they will succeed. We are no friends of the bourgeoisie. That is common knowledge. We cannot forbear an ironical smile when we observe the terrible earnestness, the pathetic enthusiasm with which the bourgeois strive to achieve their aims. They really believe that they are working on their own behalf. They are so short-sighted as to fancy that through their triumph the world will assume its final configuration. Yet nothing is more clear than that they are everywhere preparing the way for us, for the Democrats and the Communists, than that they will at most win a few years of troubled enjoyment, only to be then immediately overthrown. Behind them stands everywhere the proletariat, sometimes participating in their endeavors and partly in their illusions, as in Italy and Switzerland, sometimes silent and reserved, but secretly preparing the overthrow of the bourgeoisie, as in France and Germany, finally, in Britain and America, in open rebellion against the ruling bourgeoisie. So just fight bravely on, most gracious masters of capital. We need you for the present. Here and there we even need you as rulers. You have to clear the vestiges of the Middle Ages and of absolute monarchy out of our path. You have to annihilate patriarchalism. You have to carry out centralization. You have to convert the more or less propertyless classes into genuine proletarians, into recruits for us. By your factories and your commercial relationships you must create for us the basis of the material means which the proletariat needs for the attainment of freedom. In recompense whereof you shall be allowed to rule for a short time. You shall be allowed to dictate your laws, to bask in the rays of the majesty you have created, to spread your banquets in the halls of kings, and to take the beautiful princess to wife. But do not forget that the hangman stands at the door. As we know, the hangman's face remains well hidden. The predictions of Marx and Engels proved false. Not because their analysis of capitalism was wrong. The capitalist system, as it functioned until the middle of the 19th century, was indeed in the process of running out of steam. It was racked by regular crises of ever-increasing severity. Simultaneously, the strength and resistance of the proletariat grew. The specter of communism materialized with the Paris Commune in 1871. The bourgeoisie was terribly afraid of widespread revolution. What Marx and Engels did not foresee was that the proletariat's struggle for better living conditions would initiate new forms of imperialist accumulation which would in turn revitalize global capitalism. Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister, described this in 1933. It is said that capitalism managed to prolong its life to our day because of a factor which perhaps Marx did not fully consider. This was the exploitation of colonial empires by the industrial countries of the West. This gave fresh life and prosperity to it, at the expense, of course, of the poor countries so exploited. Colonialism was not just a centrifugal phenomenon, it was also a polarizing one. The division of the world into rich and poor countries, into center and periphery, lay the basis for capitalism's growth and longevity. Around 1850, the living conditions of the English proletariat slowly began to improve. For the first time, capitalists were paying wages above subsistence level. This was not yet a result of proletarian struggle. The workers' movement was still weak, not least due to fragmentation and corruption. Instead, the reasons for the rise in wages could be found in contradictions within the ruling class itself. English landowners had great influence in the British Parliament. In 1804, they passed a prohibition against the import of grains and other agricultural products into England. This explains why prices for foodstuffs remained high throughout the first half of the 19th century, which impacted the subsistence wages the industrialists had to pay. In essence, the landowners took a significant chunk out of the extra profits made by the monopolies of English industry. In the 1840s, the industrialists campaigned for lifting the import prohibition. Supported by the working class, they succeeded in 1846. By 1872, wheat imports had doubled and those of meat had increased eightfold. Grains now came from Prussia, Denmark, and the USA. Bread and other foods became significantly cheaper. As the prices for foodstuffs, and therefore the subsistence level, were falling in England, the industrialists wanted to decrease wages. Now, however, this was prevented by the fledgling workers' movement. The consequence was an increase in real wages. The workers' movement soon gained strength and managed to win further improvements. In 1847, the 10-hour workday was introduced, a demand that workers had been making for 30 years. The workers benefited from an unlikely alliance with the landowners, who, wanting to get back at the industrialists who had opened the domestic market to foreign agricultural products, supported the workers' cause in Parliament. Figure 1 shows the increase of real wages in England during the second half of the 19th century. Capitalism is a system out of balance. The breakthrough of industrial capitalism can be likened to a high-speed train running on subway tracks. Constant interventions by the state were necessary for capitalism to not collapse due to its internal contradictions. The state was constantly occupied with regulating and restructuring the system after each crisis. Politics are the result of class struggle, providing the economic laws with the concrete historical frameworks they present themselves in. The forms which these frameworks take are determined by the structural possibilities and limitations created by history. Analyzing the class struggle in France in 1848, Marx wrote, "People make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under circumstances they themselves have chosen, but under given and inherited circumstances with which they are directly confronted." Class struggle in Europe during the second half of the 19th century, colonialism's heyday, provided capitalism with a new framework. The global market was expanding, North America had strong purchasing power, and high profit rates secured ongoing accumulation. None of this was the result of any master plan, but of the struggle between those trying to maximize profits and those trying to receive the highest possible wages. Colonial exploitation. The colonial empire was a crucial factor in the improvement of living standards in England. Consumer goods and raw materials fueling British industry were imported. At the same time, the colonies served as foreign territories for investment and as places to relocate what Marx called the reserve army of labor, that is, the surplus population of the unemployed. It has often been claimed that the improvement of living standards for the English working class was the result of the Industrial Revolution and higher productivity. Primarily, however, the improvement was based on colonial revenue, which included taxes and fees collected by the British government from its overseas possessions. Table I shows the transfer of wealth from the colonies to Britain between 1867 and 1908. One of the few contemporaneous descriptions of England's colonial exploitation that we have comes from data by Nehroji, India's Grand Old Man. In 1882, he addressed the British Parliament in an appeal for justice for the Indian people. His arguments were based on thorough calculations of the economic drain caused by colonialism. Nehroji described how Britain's trade monopoly, colonial taxation, and the destruction of traditional, small-scale Indian manufacturing had devastated the country. Nehroji's drain theory later became the basis for the Indian National Congress's critique of colonialism. With regard to the importance of the British Empire for the development of capitalism, the American sociologist Richard Kruth wrote the following. By 1914, the British Empire covered 12.7 million square miles, of which the United Kingdom represented 121,000 or less than 100th. In terms of population, moreover, of the 410 million British subjects, constituting about 1/5 of the people of the globe, 44 million resided in the United Kingdom, only a little more than 1/10 of the empire's inhabitants. From this empire ruled by the few came total trade of about £180 million a year, bringing to Britain revenues amounting to approximately £19,500,000 sterling. And to this empire, British capital investors had sent £4 billion. By 1913. In returns, between 1880 and 1910, overseas investment earnings tripled. £57,700 million in 1880 to £170,000 million in 1910, and other income from shipping, insurance, and services increased by more than a half, £96,400,000 in 1880 to £146,700,000 in 1910. Together, the sum of trade and earnings abroad was reflected in the accelerated accumulation of capital. In the 63-year period of 1812-75, British wealth increased by £5,848 billion, as compared to a total accumulation of £7,924 billion over the following 37 years, 1876-1912. The more rapid accumulation of capital came from the large-scale expansion of colonies after 1875 and especially after 1882. For the colonies where British manufactured goods were exported and raw materials and foodstuffs were obtained offered investment and loan rewards for British capital while seeking reinvestment abroad. By the end of the 19th century, the British population had become dependent on a number of goods imported from the colonies for mass consumption, especially sugar, rice, tea, coffee, and tobacco. The most important raw material, cotton, was imported from the slave plantations of North America before the American Civil War, and from India and Egypt afterwards. Britain's entire economy had become dependent on the colonies and on control of world trade. Improvements in living standards for British workers relied on colonial profits and the relatively low prices of imported goods. The working class was integrated into what was becoming the first consumer society, and as such played an important role in maintaining the empire. By the mid-1800s, tea and coffee were regularly consumed by all classes. In 1850, the amount of sugar imported from the colonies was only surpassed by that of cotton. Tea was number 4, and coffee number 6. Even the poorest classes spent 6 to 7% of their income on colonial imports. Between 1850 and 1875, the per capita consumption of these goods increased even more, tea by 60%, sugar by 75%, tobacco by 18%, liquor by 33%, and wine by 66%. People were having tea with sugar as well as bread and jam, a new product also containing sugar, for breakfast now instead of porridge, which had been the staple food of the poor for centuries. The popularity of sugar was directly related to the energy boost it provided. While the British consumed it mainly with tea, the French had it with coffee and milk. By 1800, more than 600 coffee shops in Paris served café au lait. During the 1870s, real wages in England grew by 26%, during the 1880s by 21%, and during the 1890s by 11%. The biggest beneficiaries were skilled workers. Skilled workers earned about twice as much as their unskilled peers. The latter still received subsistence wages. The improvement in working-class living standards was safeguarded by the now well-established workers' movement. Trade unions were powerful and workers had even gained influence in Parliament. Skilled workers fought for higher wages, better working conditions, and an extension of trade union rights, often successfully. The situation was similar in France, Germany, and other Western European countries. Capitalists resisted the workers' movement, but the concessions they made, especially in terms of higher wages, did not hurt the capitalist system. On the contrary, they helped solve the crisis of overproduction by strengthening the domestic market. But the capitalist system could only afford improvements to the living conditions of European workers because of the exploitation of the colonies. The economies of the colonies themselves had by now become capitalist. Factories and mines had been established and plantations were run as capitalist enterprises. More and more capital was invested. The profits helped compensate for the decline in the profit rate in Europe caused by the increased wages for European workers. Globally, this promised to provide a long-term solution to the contradiction between production and consumption. Capital flows also changed. More capital, and therefore value, was now flowing from the colonies to the developed countries than vice versa. Prior to this, the export of capital from the developed countries to the colonies had helped balance out some of the differences in economic development. Now, the gap between rich and poor only deepened. This was necessary for the continued expansion of the capitalist mode of production. Capitalism needed the best possible conditions for the development of its productive forces. Contrary to Marx's prediction, India never became a mirror image of England. Later on in life, Marx acknowledged this. He realized that there was instead a process of polarization. In a letter to N.F. Danielson, dated February 19, 1881, he wrote, "In India serious complications, if not a general outbreak, is in store for the British government. What the English take from them annually in the form of rent, dividends for railways useless to the Hindus, pensions for military and civil service men, for Afghanistan and other wars, etc., etc. What they take from them without any equivalent and quite apart from what they appropriate to themselves annually within India, speaking only of the value of the commodities the Indians have gratuitously and annually to send over to England. It amounts to more than the total sum of income of the 60 millions of agricultural and industrial laborers of India. This is a bleeding process, with a vengeance. The famine years are pressing each other and in dimensions till now not yet suspected in Europe. Meanwhile, the development of the countries of Western Europe as well as of the settler states of the USA, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand did mirror that of England. The settler states were populated by immigrants from Europe who demanded wages similar to those at home. The colonial power structure and, in the case of the USA, slavery, made this possible. The colonies of Latin America, Asia, and Africa did not develop in the same way. To do so simply wouldn't have been possible. Their exploitation and underdevelopment was required for Europe and European settler states to get rich. Marx identified the following as an essential feature of capitalist accumulation. Accumulation of wealth at one pole is, therefore, at the same time accumulation of misery, agony of toil slavery, ignorance, brutality, mental degradation, at the opposite pole, i.e., on the side of the class that produces its own product in the form of capital. This became very obvious in the makeup of European societies during capitalism's earliest phase. The more capitalism globalized, the truer this observation became. Colonialism was a catastrophe for the world outside of Europe. From 1500 to 1900, the non-European share of the world population dropped from 83 to 62%. From dangerous classes to citizens. The roots of the political organizations of the working class can be found in the craft guilds, which adhered to strict regulations and rituals. An early challenge for the labor movement was to unite workers who often strongly identified with their particular trade. But internal problems were far from the only challenge the movement was facing. The repression by the state and the bourgeoisie was relentless. The ruling classes were afraid of a revolution instigated by those for whom strikes and sabotage had become common forms of action. The French Revolution of 1789 was still on everyone's mind, and a wave of revolutionary uprisings swept across Europe in 1848. By the second half of the 19th century, the ruling classes had changed their approach. They preferred reforms to the risk of revolution. In the 1870s, both Napoleon III in France and the Conservative Parliament in Britain allowed the workers to organize. In 1871, the British Parliament officially recognized trade unions. In France, this right was granted a little later, after the demise of the Paris Commune. Those in power hoped that incorporating the dangerous classes into the political machine and granting them citizenship would make controlling them easier. Workers, men only, were allowed to vote, and social benefits and health insurance were gradually introduced. The proletariat became part of the nation. To counteract this development, the International Workingmen's Association, IWA, better known as the First International, was founded in 1864. It consisted mainly of English and French trade unions, as well as individual socialists, communists, and anarchists. What united its members was the desire to organize the proletariat on the basis of class, disregarding national identity. Class was more important than citizenship. The main conflict within the First International concerned the role of the state. The anarchist Mikhail Bakunin was in opposition to any form of state power and argued for the state to be abolished. Marx, on the other hand, championed a two-step strategy. State power had to be seized before that which was seized could wither away in a socialist society. The question of how to seize state power would later divide the socialist movement into reformists and revolutionaries. In the decades that followed the founding of the First International, the socialist movement was growing fast. Socialist parties were established all across Europe, and trade unions became increasingly powerful. At the same time, socialists were slowly incorporated into the political system and thereby de-radicalized. The Bolsheviks of Russia, on Europe's margins, were among the exceptions to this trend. In Western Europe, the workers had left the barricades of 1848 and 1871 and were entering parliaments. They now faced their employers across the negotiation table. The First International dissolved in 1876. The new economic conditions changed the political dimensions of class struggle. In Europe and in the European settler colonies, employers could now afford to make concessions to the labor movement. This, in turn, strengthened the workers' belief in reformism. For the employers, accepting certain reforms was far less risky than provoking revolutionary uprisings. This served both sides. Measured by today's standards, even the top tier of the English working class, skilled industrial workers, still lived poorly, but their living conditions had improved dramatically within a relatively short period of time, and they were far superior to those of the workers in the colonies. At the beginning of the 20th century, widespread hunger, which we still see in the global South today, had basically disappeared from England and most Western European countries. The improved living conditions and political influence of the working class were not the result of some shrewd capitalist plot or a payoff to keep workers submissive. They were a consequence of working class struggles. Yet, they would not have been possible without imperialism. To speak of bribes for the working class, as some anti-imperialist organizations did, KAK included, is an oversimplification. But as a result of improving conditions for the European working classes, the reformist sections of the labor movement were certainly strengthened and the revolutionary ones weakened. Whereas the Paris Commune had been crushed, many reformist campaigns had scored victories. Reformism seemed capable of improving conditions for the proletariat. In 1848, Marx and Engels optimistically expected the international proletariat to unite and advance toward world revolution. This was expressed in the famous rallying cry of the Communist Manifesto, "Working men of all countries, unite." As time went on, Marx and Engels became more cautious. Their analysis of how England's global domination, colonialism, and the bourgeoisification of the working class were interconnected is revealing. In a letter to Marx dated October 7, 1858, Engels wrote, "The English proletariat is actually becoming more and more bourgeois, so that this most bourgeois of all nations is apparently aiming ultimately at the possession of a bourgeois aristocracy and a bourgeois proletariat alongside the bourgeoisie. For a nation which exploits the whole world, this is of course to a certain extent justifiable. The only thing that would help here would be a few thoroughly bad years, but since the gold discoveries these no longer seem so easy to come by." In a letter to Karl Kautsky he expressed similar sentiments. "You ask me what the English workers think about colonial policy. Well, exactly the same as they think about politics in general, the same as the bourgeois think. There is no workers' party here, you see, there are only conservatives and liberal radicals, and the workers gaily share the feast of England's monopoly of the world market and the colonies." National chauvinism began to be embraced by members of the English proletariat in the mid-19th century. In a letter to Siegfried Meyer and August Voigt, dated April 9, 1870, Marx elaborated on the attitudes of the English working class toward the Irish, and most important of all, Every industrial and commercial center in England now possesses a working class divided into two hostile camps, English proletarians and Irish proletarians. The ordinary English worker hates the Irish worker as a competitor who lowers his standard of life. In relation to the Irish worker, he feels himself a member of the ruling nation and so turns himself into a tool of the aristocrats and capitalists of his country against Ireland, thus strengthening their domination over himself. He cherishes religious, social, and national prejudices against the Irish worker. His attitude towards him is much the same as that of the poor whites to the niggers in the former slave states of the USA. The Irishman pays him back with interest in his own money. He sees in the English worker at once the accomplice and the stupid tool of the English rule in Ireland. This antagonism is the secret of the impotence of the English working class, despite its organization. It is the secret by which the capitalist class maintains its power. And that class is fully aware of it. Therefore, to hasten the social revolution in England is the most important object of the International Workingmen's Association. The sole means of hastening it is to make Ireland independent. Hence it is the task of the International everywhere to put the conflict between England and Ireland in the foreground, and everywhere to side openly with Ireland. And it is the special task of the Central Council in London to awaken a consciousness in the English workers that for them the national emancipation of Ireland is no question of abstract justice or humanitarian sentiment, but the first condition of their own social emancipation. The first International Central Council did not succeed in raising awareness about the conditions in the colonies among English workers, nor was it able to convince them that the liberation of the colonies was a precondition for their own. Socialist movements were eager to clarify who was producing value within the nation. In comparison, the question of who was producing value globally was basically ignored. This prevented an understanding of capitalism as a global system. Socialists therefore contributed to the majority of the English working class embracing and defending the empire. Historical research has confirmed the connection between colonialism and the development of a first world labor aristocracy. Considering wage levels, working conditions, social security, and class relations, the English historian Eric Hobsbawm concluded that this process began in the 1840s. The further we progress into the imperialist era, the more difficult does it become to put one's finger on groups of workers which did not, in one way or another, draw some advantage from Britain's position, who were not able to live rather better than they would have done in a country whose bourgeoisie possessed fewer accumulated claims to profit and dividends abroad, or power to dictate the terms of trade with backwards areas. Or, since there is no simple correlation between the standard of living and political moderation, on workers who could not be made to feel that their interests depended on the continuance of imperialism. It is indeed true that the benefits of imperialism and its promises were unevenly distributed among various workers at any given time, and that some of the mechanisms for distributing them did not come into full operation until the interwar years. It is equally true that the growing crisis of the British economy complicated the pattern. But, on the whole, the change remains. To sum up, the roots of British reformism no doubt lie in the history of a century of economic world supremacy and the creation of a labor aristocracy, or even more generally, of an entire working class which drew advantages from it. The British economist Joan Robinson has summarized the related economic process. It was not only superior productivity that caused capitalist wealth to grow. The whole world was ransacked for resources. The dominions overseas that European nations had been acquiring and fighting over since the 16th century and others also were now greatly developed to supply raw materials to industry. According to Robinson, the industrial workers in the home countries profited from imperialism in three ways. First, raw materials and foodstuffs were cheap in comparison to manufactured goods, boosting the purchasing power of the workers. Second, the profits made by industry, commerce, and finance benefited society at large through taxes, while ongoing investments meant a high demand for labor. Third, imperialism equipped the industrial workers of Europe with a sense of national and racial superiority. The industrial working class became an integral part of the capitalist nation. Much research has been done on the English labor aristocracy of the 19th century. Scholars commonly agree that it consisted of skilled workers organized in trade unions. They constituted the top tier of the proletariat. Its size and significance within the class as a whole fluctuated throughout the second half of the 19th century. This largely depended on whether the economy was booming or stagnating. Research shows that real wages in both England and France doubled between 1850 and 1900. In the face of these developments, Marx changed his thoughts on revolution. In the Communist Manifesto, published in 1848, and in his articles about India in the New York Daily Tribune from the early 1850s, Marx saw capitalism as a progressive, if barbaric, force. He thought that the liberation of Asia depended on the revolution in Europe. But he adjusted his views after studying the Taiping Rebellion, the Opium Wars, various uprisings in India, and the slave economy in the USA. Marx supported the Taiping Rebellion, which had been triggered by a British war of aggression. He now believed that the wave of uprisings against the British, stretching from China to India to Persia, would impact conditions in Britain itself and, consequently, in continental Europe. This would accelerate capitalism's crisis and possibly cause revolution. In the 1860s, Marx applied this analysis to the situation in Ireland. Once again, he stressed his belief that the struggle for independence in the colonies would contribute to revolutionary developments in the imperialist countries themselves. In a letter dated December 11, 1869, he wrote to Friedrich Engels, "For a long time I believed that it would be possible to overthrow the Irish regime by English working-class ascendancy. I always expressed this point of view in the New York Tribune. Deeper study has now convinced me of the opposite. The English working class will never accomplish anything before it has got rid of Ireland. The lever must be applied in Ireland. That is why the Irish question is so important for the social movement in general." In other words, Ireland's liberation did not depend on working-class struggle in England. The revolutionary working-class struggle in England depended on the Irish struggle. Marx and Engels hoped that the advance of capitalist nations in continental Europe, and the challenge this posed to English dominance, would change the dynamics of the English workers' movement, members of the labor aristocracy becoming revolutionaries once again. Such was not to be. Capitalism did not develop as predicted by Marx and Engels. When the imperialist center in England was troubled, it simply expanded to include Western Europe and North America. The English labor aristocracy did not disappear and give way to a revitalized revolutionary workers' movement. Instead, it was now joined by a labor aristocracy on the European continent and one across the Atlantic. Politically, the countries that had now entered the imperialist center developed in the same way England had developed a few decades earlier. Workers successfully fought for higher wages, better working conditions, and more political rights within the framework of bourgeois parliamentary politics. Reformism had won. Housewifization. In the context of the imperialist center's dangerous classes having become citizens of the nation, I want to address two issues more closely: gender and racism. During the first phase of industrialization, women and children comprised a significant part of the workforce. Many women were employed in the textile industry, which played a central role in the Industrial Revolution until the mid-1800s. As historian Maxine Berg explains, it was the female, and not the male, workforce, which counted in the most important high-productivity industry of the period, textiles. Where the female labor force outnumbered the male by 4-to-1 or even 8-to-1. The available data suggests that, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, as many women as men were employed as industrial workers, if not more. In the 1850s, about 40% of workers in Paris were women. They were popular among employers because their pay was often only a third of what their male colleagues received. But this was not the only reason for their popularity. They were also regarded as the least troublesome workers. Only men belonged to guilds and modern working-class organizations. Marx's labor theory of value was based on working-class families in which the wife did not engage in wage labor. For Marx, the inclusion of women and children into the industrial workforce meant a decrease in the value of labor power. In Capital, he wrote, the value of labor power was determined not only by the labor time necessary to maintain the individual adult laborer, but also by that necessary to maintain his family. Machinery, by throwing every member of that family onto the labor market, spreads the value of the man's labor power over his whole family. It thus depreciates his labor power. To purchase the labor power of a family of 4 workers may, perhaps, cost more than it formerly did to purchase the labor power of the head of the family, but, in return, 4 days' labor takes the place of 1, and their price falls in proportion to the excess of the surplus labor of 4 over the surplus labor of 1. In order that the family may live, for people must now not only labor, but expend surplus labor for the capitalist. Taking the exchange of commodities as our basis, our first assumption was that capitalist and laborer met as free persons, as independent owners of commodities, the one possessing money and means of production, the other labor power. But now the capitalist buys children and young persons under age. Previously, the workman sold his own labor power, which he disposed of nominally as a free agent. Now he sells wife and child. He has become a slave dealer. Marx is attributing the value created by a wage-laboring woman to her husband rather than to herself was based on empirical rather than moral grounds. In a motion filed by Marx at the First Congress of the International Workingmen's Association in 1866, he describes the fact that women were entering the labor market as progressive. This sentiment, however, was not shared by the labor movement at large. The powerful German workers' organizations saw women entering the labor market as a threat to men's employment and wages. A majority of German delegates at the 1866 IWA Congress, led by Ferdinand Lassalle, opposed Marx's motion. So did a majority of the French delegates. The following resolution was passed instead: the employment of women in the workshops and modern industry is one of the most outrageous abuses of our time. Due particularly to the destruction of the family, the working population ends up in such a miserable condition that they lose even the last trace of cultural and ideal values they had so far. Therefore, the tendency to further extend the labor market for women has to be condemned. This resolution was, in fact, a compromise. The German delegates had argued for a complete ban on women in industrial jobs due to health concerns. The final resolution did not call for a ban, but criticized the conditions women had to work under. The underlying issue, of course, was that the workers' movement fought for a family wage, that is, a wage high enough for a male worker to sustain his family as the head of the household. The notion of the man as provider was central to the 19th century workers' movement. Before that, it was only in bourgeois families that the man by himself was economically responsible for the family while the woman stayed at home. Among workers, peasants, and even craftsmen, everybody contributed to the family's income. The workers' movement contributed to the housewifization of women, ostensibly to protect women from exploitation. The main issues, however, were competition on the labor market and wages. Male workers demanding higher wages as providers did not want to see this strategy undermined. Real change in the workers' movement regarding gender equality only occurred in the 1960s. With its long-standing opposition to women entering the workforce, the workers' movement contributed to domestic and reproductive labor, in short, housework, becoming regarded as a natural resource, much like air and water. The housewife's job was to make sure that her husband could return to his real job day after day, and to nurture a new generation of workers and housewives. Working-class women remained economically shackled to their husbands, as men were the only ones able to provide the income needed for a family to survive. One of the reasons for the patriarchal nuclear family model spreading into the working class was colonial profits. The gender roles championed by the workers' movement in the late 19th century corresponded to the development of the labor aristocracy. During the second half of the 19th century, the ratio of women to men in the industrial workforce fell by 0.7% a year on average. During the 1780s, the percentage of married women in the small town of Cardington who worked for a wage was 67.5%. In 1911, in all of England it was 10%. This shift was due to factory legislation, the 10-hour workday, rising wages, and the spread of the bourgeois family model within the working class. Maria Mies described this process as follows: without the ongoing exploitation of external colonies, formerly as direct colonies, today within the new international division of labor, the establishment of the internal colony, that is, a nuclear family and a woman maintained by a male breadwinner, would not have been possible. White men in Western Europe and North America ruled over their own colonies in the form of the nuclear family, with a wife forced to stay at home. This was one of the most important factors ensuring that the unpropertied and formerly dangerous proletarian would become a loyal citizen. Like the workers' movement, the women's movement emerged in the 19th century, and there were some overlaps. In general, however, the two movements developed independently from one another. Alliances were rare. Important and influential sections of the workers' movement saw the women's movement as a distraction or an outright competitor. There were exceptions, however. In the first half of the 19th century, the French socialist and feminist Flora Tristan was a strong advocate for both internationalism and women's rights in the workers' movement. In her most important work, The Workers' Union, published in 1843, she wrote, "All working-class ills can be summed up in two words: poverty and ignorance. Now, in order to get out of this maze, I see only one way: begin by educating women, because women are in charge of instructing boys and girls." Tristan saw women as the proletariat's proletariat. For her, the workers' struggle and the women's struggle were inseparable. But her view wasn't shared by many in the workers' movement, although there was more openness in France than in other countries, likely due to the prominent role of several women during the Paris Commune of 1871. In 1879, Hubertine Auclert gave a famous speech at the Third French National Workers' Congress, stating that she was present not because I am a worker, but because I am a woman, that is, one who is exploited, a slave delegated by 9 million slaves. She, too, called for an alliance between the workers' movement and the women's movement, ending her speech with the words, "Oh, proletarians, if you wish to be free, cease being unjust." With modern science, with the awareness that science knows no prejudices, say, equality for all men, equality between men and women. Subsequently, the Congress passed a resolution that emphasized the common experiences of workers of both genders, and women's right to equal wages, but also women's duty to look after the children. The patriarchal family model appealed to those in the working class aspiring to mimic the lives of the middle and upper classes. Capital and the bourgeoisie saw the division of gender roles as a stabilizing factor within the workforce and in society at large. The only ones protesting were early feminists. The new academic field of humanities legitimized the division in the name of science. It stressed the physiological and psychological differences between the men and women, suggesting that woman's role as housewife corresponded to her nature. The only role for women in public affairs was to express empathy, as for example in the anti-slavery movement, where many women, prominent feminists included, got their first organizing experiences. Racism and biopolitics. The European workers' movement not only found it difficult to stand in solidarity with the women's movement, but it also showed an almost complete lack of sympathy for the struggles of indigenous and oppressed peoples in the colonies. This was particularly pronounced in the attitudes of the white U.S. working class toward enslaved Africans. The attitudes of English workers toward Irish immigrants were similar. They were seen as competitors on the labor market and met with hostility. As a result of colonialism, racism and notions of European superiority emerged, and the mainstream workers' movement was far from immune to this. In The Wretched of the Earth, the psychiatrist and anti-colonial militant Frantz Fanon wrote, "Latin America, China, and Africa. From all these continents, under whose eyes Europe today raises up her tower of opulence, there has flowed out for centuries towards that same Europe diamonds and oil, silk and cotton, wood and exotic products. Europe is literally the creation of the Third World." When Fanon wrote that Europe is the creation of the Third World, he meant it literally. This was not limited to material or economic aspects. In colonial discourse, European came to mean civilized, other peoples were barbaric. Such claims were made despite the obvious barbarism of European civilization. Democracy and social justice might have been hot topics in Europe and North America, but that did little to stop European oppression, plunder, and exploitation around the world. The distinction between us and them was necessary to justify this contradiction. Racism reflects the hierarchical division of humankind created by colonialism. The dehumanization of the colony's indigenous and oppressed peoples was a prerequisite for presenting the Western world as the supposed cradle of civilization. An important element of this narrative was the drawing of an unbroken line from ancient Greece to the economic and political system of 19th century Europe. It was said that explanations for the liberal market being the solution to all of our problems could already be found in Greek philosophy. The fact that ancient Greece was far more oriented toward the south and the east was conveniently ignored. Instead, a historical trajectory was invented that had no basis in reality. During ancient Greece's heyday, the societies of continental Europe were far less developed than many others across the world. Europe was an insignificant region. Only in the 14th century, with the onset of the Renaissance, was ancient Greece imagined to be the origin of European civilization. But even during the so-called Middle Ages, Europe was far from a world power, be it economically, politically, or culturally. The Christian legacy, allegedly a defining feature of European civilization, is also a historical fabrication. The founders of Christianity did not hail from Paris, Rome, or Berlin, but from the Middle East. Not only did the fathers of the Egyptian and Syrian churches, the world's oldest, have to be Europeanized, but also the Holy Family itself. Jesus was now represented as a blonde, blue-eyed European. Like patriarchy, racism was justified by science. The Aryan race was declared superior. It had the natural right, even the duty, to dominate the primitive races. So-called racial hygiene was a widely accepted practice in early 20th century Europe. Racism became popularized in literature, for example in Rudyard Kipling's famous poem The White Man's Burden. Across Europe, Africans, Chinese, Indians, Bedouins, and Inuit were exhibited at fairs and carnivals. This was deemed acceptable due to the alleged hierarchy between the races. Asians, deemed cultured and ranked relatively high in the hierarchy, were exhibited in small wooden cottages. Africans and the indigenous people of European settler colonies were ranked lowest in the hierarchy and exhibited in cages. There were already anti-racist movements in Europe and North America in the late 19th century, but they were weak compared with both the workers' and the women's movement. Within the workers' movement, the anti-racist struggle shared the fate of the women's struggle and was subordinated to class issues. Just like gender, race only became a priority within the left in the 1960s. Subsequent theoretical approaches, such as triple oppression, would treat gender, race, and class as equally important. Racism became highly institutionalized. In connection with the transformation of the dangerous classes into loyal citizens of the nation, the state became increasingly interested in citizens' concerns and aspirations, in their health, their education, and so on. This was now seen as a source of national strength and well-being. New sciences and politics emerged to properly surveil, control, and make use of the population. This is what Michel Foucault would later dub biopolitics or biopower. The ruling classes showing interest in the population's well-being was a new phenomenon. During the Middle Ages and the first centuries of modernity, power over life, as Foucault put it, did not yet exist. Power was direct and brutal, of power over death. The life of ordinary people was in the hands of the rulers and depended on their mercy. To control the population meant to frighten people into submission by acts of random violence. Biopolitics means that the state controls the population by surveilling and registering citizens in the name of science. It considers a healthy population a precondition for economic productivity and social stability. This is closely related to the notion of the welfare state. The welfare state, however, was not implemented from above. The ruling classes were forced to implement it due to pressure from below. It was the workers' movement that demanded health benefits, unemployment insurance, and pension funds. The welfare state was a compromise between capital and the proletariat, mitigating class struggle. Capital benefited from healthy and content workers, but there was a sinister side to this process. The welfare system tied the workers to the nation-state that provided for them. Biopolitics fostered nationalism, which, in turn, strengthened colonialism. Health and contentment for the people of some countries meant misery and death for those of others. Mark G. E. Kelly has called this phenomenon biopolitical imperialism. One might imagine that biopolitical imperialism would mean a flow of biopolitics itself outward into the periphery. I argue that, though some movement in this direction does exist, it is not the main way in which biopolitical imperialism operates. Imperialism is a form of power that by and large does not care about the lives of its victims. Imperialism, therefore, is primarily thanatopolitical, a politics of death, contrasting with the biopolitics of the population found in the imperial metropole. There is, I contend, a direct relation between the two things, in which death is figuratively exported and life imported back, in a systematic degradation of the possibilities for biopolitics in the periphery, arising out of the operation of biopolitics in the center. Kelly refers to the work of urban theorist Mike Davis for concrete examples of biopolitical imperialism. In case studies from India, China, and Brazil, Davis has shown how the imperialist powers, either through direct political intervention or by creating damaging economic conditions, have undermined public health and social welfare in these countries in order to ensure profits used to finance public health and social welfare systems at home. One example was the massive export of foodstuffs from India to Britain in the late 19th century, at a time when masses of Indians suffered starvation, between 1875 and 1900, a period that included the worst famines in Indian history. Annual grain exports increased from 3 to 10 million tons, equivalent to the annual nutrition of 25 million people. Indeed, by the turn of the century, India was supplying nearly a fifth of Britain's wheat consumption at the cost of its own food security. As an example of how the British restructured the Indian economy without regard for the needs of the Indian people, Davis refers to the famine of 1899-1900, in which 143,000 Bararis died. During those years, writes Davis, the province exported not only thousands of bales of cotton but an incredible 747,000 bushels of grain, he adds. India also had to finance British military supremacy in Asia. In addition to incessant proxy warfare with Russia on the Afghan frontier, the subcontinent's masses also subsidized such far-flung adventures of the Indian Army as the occupation of Egypt, the invasion of Ethiopia, and the conquest of the Sudan. As a result, military expenditures never comprised less than 25%, 34% including police, of India's annual budget. The two very different forms of society that biopolitics created were not always separated geographically. In the settler colonies, they existed alongside one another. This made it frighteningly obvious how the well-being of some meant the slavery, exploitation, and death of others. Settlerism. We have pointed out the significance of both the workers' movement and imperialism for the improvement of wages and living conditions among the working classes of Western Europe. There was another important factor that made this possible: immigration to the colonies. This reduced the reserve army of labor and increased the bargaining power of those workers who remained. Until World War I, there were few restrictions on the movement of European labor across national borders. Passports were rarely used and immigrants obtained citizenship easily. About 70 million people emigrated from Europe in the late 19th and the early 20th centuries. Considering that about 400 million people were living in Europe in 1900, this amounted to 17% of the population. 36 million went to the USA, 6.6 million to Canada, 5.7 million to Argentina, 5.6 million to Brazil, and smaller numbers to Australia, New Zealand, Rhodesia, South Africa, Algeria, and other colonies. Today, the population of European descendants in the old settler colonies is bigger than that in Europe itself. Immigration also served as a safety valve to reduce social unrest. Cecil Rhodes, a pivotal figure in the colonization of Southern Africa, made this very clear in 1895. I was in the East End of London, a working-class quarter, yesterday, and attended a meeting of the unemployed. I listened to the wild speeches, which were just a cry for bread. Bread, and on my way home I wandered over the scene and I became more than ever convinced of the importance of imperialism. My cherished idea is a solution for the social problem, i.e., in order to save the 40 million inhabitants of the United Kingdom from a bloody civil war, we colonial statesmen must acquire new lands to settle the surplus population, to provide new markets for the goods produced in the factories and mines. The empire, as I have always said, is a bread and butter question. If you want to avoid civil war, you must become imperialists. Mass immigration from Europe strengthened both the labor aristocracy in Europe and the labor aristocracy of European settlers in the colonies. It is important to emphasize the character of the labor aristocracy in the colonies, as Europeans were not the only immigrants. Immigrants from other countries, especially from India and China, also arrived, but under very different circumstances. Most of them were contract laborers, so-called coolies. Together with slaves and the indigenous population, they had to do the hardest work for the lowest wage. They built railways and worked in mines and on plantations. Once they tried to better their situation, the European settlers saw them as rivals on the labor market. In the 1880s, the first restrictions on immigration from Asia were implemented. In Australia, European language tests for immigrants were introduced. Soon after, Australia enforced a full stop on immigration from China. The situation was similar in the USA, Canada, and New Zealand. By 1920, immigration for non-Europeans was heavily regulated in all of the English-speaking settler colonies. Settler colonies can be divided between colonies where the indigenous population was primarily driven off their lands, for example, in North America, Australia, New Zealand, and later in Israel, and colonies where the indigenous population was primarily exploited, for example in South Africa, Rhodesia, and Algeria. Settlers in the former category of colonies were looking for land. The local population was not asked for permission, they were displaced. Of the roughly 10 million indigenous people living in North America when colonization began, less than 300,000 remained in 1900, most of them confined to reservations. The indigenous people had not surrendered their land, their resources, and their culture without resistance, but were repressed by brute force. The European settlers saw them as parasites to be extinguished. Marx wrote in Capital, "Those sober virtuosi of Protestantism, the Puritans of New England, in 1703, by decrees of their assembly set a premium of £40 on every Indian scalp and every captured redskin, and 1720 a premium of £100 on every scalp." In 1744, after Massachusetts Bay had proclaimed a certain tribe as rebels, the following prices: for a male scalp of 12 years and upwards £100, new currency; for a male prisoner £105, for women and children prisoners £50, for scalps of women and children £50. It is astonishing that white America, through pulp fiction and Hollywood films, was able to turn scalping into a supposedly indigenous practice. In reality, scalping was primarily used by settlers. In the early 18th century, the colonial government paid generous rewards for the scalps of Native Americans. The exact amount depended on factors such as gender and age, with the goal being to make the violent oppression of indigenous people as effective as possible. The colonial government also resorted to biological warfare. In 1763, Fort Pitt, which later became modern-day Pittsburgh, was besieged by Delaware warriors during what was known as Pontiac's War. When Delaware leaders offered the encircled troops safe passage from the fort to avoid an impending attack, the settler army entered negotiations and, as a sign of goodwill, offered the Delaware blankets, silk shawls, and linen, all of them infected with smallpox. Captain William Trent, who took part in the negotiations, noted in his journal, "Out of regard to them we gave them 2 blankets and a handkerchief out of the smallpox hospital. I hope it will have the desired effect." He later sent a bill to the British government, replace in kind those items which were taken from people in the hospital to convey the smallpox to the Indians. This is but one particularly well-documented example. According to the historian David Dixon, it was deliberate British policy to infect the Indians with smallpox. The genocide suffered by the indigenous population was no accident, but was a deliberate act by European settlers and their political representatives. This was part of a Republican ideology resting on the equation of liberty with private property. Under the leadership of Thomas Jefferson, an empire of liberty was built by destroying the commons of the indigenous peoples. If these peoples didn't surrender their lands voluntarily, war was the only answer. In 1790, Secretary of War Henry Knox ordered the U.S. Army to extirpate, utterly, if possible, an Ohio gathering of Native Americans who had rejected demands to surrender their lands. President Jefferson, in 1807, noted in a letter on indigenous resistance in Michigan, "If ever we are constrained to lift the hatchet against any tribe, we will never lay it down till that tribe is exterminated or driven beyond the Mississippi." Jefferson added that if they will kill some of us, we shall destroy all of them. Those executing the political orders shared the same attitude. Most infamous is General Philip Henry Sheridan's statement that the only good Indians I ever saw were dead. The privatization of the indigenous commons, and the subsequent land speculation in connection with massive infrastructural projects such as the construction of railways and ports, are part of the primitive accumulation that made the success story of American capitalism possible. In the settler colonies of Rhodesia, South Africa, and Algeria, land was an important issue as well. But apart from being driven from their lands, the local population was also forced to work in agriculture and mining. European settlers and locals were separated by apartheid systems. The obvious difference between the living conditions of two communities living on the same territory created strife of particular intensity. The armed conflict leading to the liberation of Algeria in the 1960s cost 1 million lives. While European settlers imposed European culture upon the indigenous people of the colonies, they also demanded independence from their countries of origin. The settlers wanted to harvest the fruits of colonial exploitation themselves rather than returning them to the motherland. The USA, from colony to imperialist superpower. The colonies of Asia and Africa did not establish strong capitalist economies. In the context of the capitalist world system, they remained primarily suppliers of raw materials and tropical agricultural products. They formed the system's periphery. Development in the settler colonies of North America, and later those of Australia and New Zealand, was very different. The settlers of these colonies gained, complete or relative, political independence from Europe early on. The USA became independent in 1776. This meant that the profits made by an exploitative settler economy now stayed, for the most part, in the country itself, which contributed to a domestic accumulation of capital. In roughly 100 years, the USA went from being a colony to one of the world's leading capitalist powers. What made this possible, and why did other colonies rich in resources, for example India, become part of the periphery instead? Let us compare the colonization of North America in the 17th century with that of South America 100 years earlier. Portugal and Spain were feudal societies. They arrived in armor, intent on conquering and plundering any society they encountered. They built colonial economies based on feudalism, with big estates and plantations. The labor force consisted primarily of slaves. In North America, the early colonists were merchants and plantation owners with an interest in trade. Investments were important. They had a long-term vision for themselves. In the beginning, the merchants bought fur and agricultural products from small farmers for export. Tobacco was one of the most important trading goods. When big plantations were established, production was also geared toward export. The plantations produced sugar, rice, and cotton. To acquire land, a lot of land, was no problem, but the cost of waged labor was high. Attempts to establish a cheap labor force based on the forced labor of prisoners and the indentured labor of impoverished peasants and craftsmen from Britain failed. Once the latter arrived, they fled the plantations and looked for land of their own. What really made the plantation economy blossom was slavery. While the merchants and plantation owners of North America had close ties to British merchant capital, the vast majority of European settlers had none. They were mainly displaced peasants and proletarianized craftsmen who had come to America to find land and work. They had not come to return anything to Europe. Many of them had also suffered political or religious persecution. These men and women were determined to stand up for their beliefs. They had no attachment to the countries they came from, neither economically nor politically nor religiously. This was an important factor in the later separation from Britain. From the perspective of merchant capital, these settlers weren't of much use. They didn't produce anything that could be exported to Europe for a profit, and they hardly bought anything from Europe. Their communities were largely self-sufficient. Early on, industrial capitalists in Britain expressed concern about the development of North America. They saw a powerful rival coming. This was the reason for England introducing protectionist laws in the early 18th century, which only augmented the tensions between the settlers and the European governments. The relationship between the settlers and the European powers was ambiguous. On the one hand, the settlers were agents of the latter, the colonizers on the ground. They administered the colonial territories and brutally crushed any resistance by the indigenous population. On the other hand, their ambition was to become independent. They developed their own national identities and came to see the European powers as forces of occupation that robbed them of their own wealth. In an ironic twist, the settlers themselves became anti-colonial. This was not limited to North America. In South Africa, the Boers, settlers who had arrived from the Netherlands, fought brutal wars against the British over the control of the territory and its riches, using the rhetoric of revolutionary republicanism to justify their cause. Until the end of the 19th century, the economy of North America was characterized by two things: a surplus of fertile land and a shortage of labor. The two were connected. Labor was expensive because land was cheap. As Marx explained, hence the relatively high standard of wages in the United States. Capital may there try its utmost. It cannot prevent the labor market from being continuously emptied by continuous conversion of wages laborers into independent self-sustaining peasants. In 1759, the governor of Virginia, Francis Fauquier, expressed his distress over not being able to recruit people into the army. "Every man in this colony has land, and none but Negroes are laborers." Agriculture was the mainstay of the economy during the early colonization of North America. The grains and agricultural products of New England were mainly used for local consumption, but wheat and fish were exported to the English colonies in the West Indies. In the South, agriculture was always export-oriented. There was an abundance of tobacco plantations in Virginia and Maryland. The leaves were exclusively exported to England where, to the frustration of the tobacco planters, imports were highly taxed. Once the leaves were processed, England exported tobacco goods to the rest of Europe tax-free. The rice produced in the swamps of South Carolina was also exclusively exported to England, which resold it to Germany and Italy, undercutting Egyptian competition. South Carolina also exported indigo, which was used for dyeing textiles. The labor shortage was a big problem for the plantations in the South, solved by slavery. From 1700 to 1781, 256,000 captive laborers arrived. The number was modest compared with the West Indies, yet there was an important difference. In the West Indies, slaves were worked to death and replaced with new captives, whereas the settlers of North Americans tried to reproduce the existing slave population. The southern plantation colonies were closely linked to English merchant capital, but, unlike the colonies of the West Indies, they were not governed by English trading companies. North American settlers demanded to be treated with respect by the English. France in North America. The political situation in North America was not only characterized by tensions between the settlers and the English government. There were also conflicts between competing European powers. The Dutch had lost New Amsterdam, modern-day New York, to the English in the 1660s and no longer were a factor in the division of the continent, but the French had a significant presence. Most of the French settlers hailed from Canada where they lived as hunters and traders. They founded Quebec City in 1608 and settled along the St. Lawrence all the way up to the Great Lakes. From there, they followed the Mississippi south and founded New Orleans and its delta. The background to the colonial presence of the French in North America was different from that of the English. In both England and France, the conflict between the feudal aristocracy and the bourgeoisie took on a religious dimension, with Catholics and Protestants fighting one another. But the outcomes were different. In France, the Catholics had the upper hand. When the Huguenot Henry IV became king, he converted to Catholicism, famously remarking that Paris is worth a mass. Cardinal Richelieu, the second most powerful figure in the French state after Henry IV, implemented an absolutist regime which relied on strong feudal forces able to control a still weak bourgeoisie. For the French colonies, this meant that they were largely governed from France with an iron hand. The French colonies in North America stretched over an enormous territory, but were sparsely populated. It required many French troops to protect them. Economically, they were rather insignificant. The economy mainly consisted of hunting, the trade in fur and lumber, and fishing in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. French settlers were significantly outnumbered by settlers from England. In the year 1700, there were 15,000 French settlers and 360,000 from England. Yet, the French possessions encircled the English ones and hindered English expansion both to the west, the north, and, at least partly, to the south. England and France were used to going to war in Europe. Now it was time to do so in North America. With the 1713 Peace of Utrecht, which ended what was known as the Spanish War of Succession, France was forced to hand most of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia to the English. This didn't settle matters, however, for both countries still claimed Ohio. War broke out in 1752. It would last 7 years. In its earliest phase, the English settlers were no match for the regular French troops, but in 1757 fortunes shifted when England sent its navy, blockading the sea lanes used by the French to send supplies. The English also provided troops. English victory was secured at the Battle of Quebec in 1759. France had to give up further territories in Canada as well as Louisiana east of the Mississippi. Spain, which had supported the French, was forced to give up its only possession in North America, Florida. England now ruled over North America from Hudson's Bay in the north to the Florida Peninsula in the south, and from the Atlantic coast in the east to the Mississippi in the west. France was never again able to threaten English dominance on the continent. England in North America. Against their common enemy, the French, the English settlers of North America and the English government joined forces. But this alliance of convenience was far from harmonious. The economic interests of the parties involved were too different. English merchant capital tried to enforce monopolies in the trade with North America. This especially infuriated the settlers of New England, who produced many of the same goods as the English. At the same time, they were able to sell fish and a number of agricultural products on the Caribbean market for lower prices than the English, which meant huge losses for the motherland. Furthermore, the North American colonies imported sugar, rum, tobacco, and other Caribbean products without the involvement of English merchants. The English government tried to prevent the trade between the North American and Caribbean colonies with the help of strict trade regulations and customs laws, but this only led to an increase in counterfeit goods. When the English government responded with increased law enforcement and legal persecution, tensions with the settlers only magnified. The two parties didn't see eye to eye regarding the land question either. This became particularly obvious when it came to dividing the territories recently won from the French. The farmers of New England, the plantation owners of the South, and American merchants all made claims, but so did English capitalists. The English government passed a law granting control over the territories to the English crown. Wild speculation followed, benefiting English capitalists, merchants, officials, and landowners. For the settlers, it only confirmed that any ongoing alliance with the English motherland would be an obstacle to their own economic development. The war with France had led to an economic boom in New England. The European governments sent money to pay the soldiers' wages and their supplies, while American merchants made a fortune in illegal trade with France and Spain. Meanwhile, England had to cover the expenses. One of the measures taken by the government was the passing of new customs fees and import tariffs in 1767. A special department was established in Boston to oversee their implementation. The settlers were outraged. Plantation owners, merchants, and farmers were united in their opposition to what they perceived as ongoing exploitation by the English. When, in December 1773, merchant ships belonging to the East India Company arrived in Boston to unload tea, the Americans refused to pay the tariffs and told them to sail away. The dispute resulted in the famous Boston Tea Party, when a group of settlers disguised as Mohawks stormed 3 English ships and threw 342 chests of tea into the sea. When the English government strengthened its colonial administration, the settlers became determined to end all trade with the motherland. When the English sent troops to restore order, the settlers declared independence in 1776. This led to the 7-Year War of Independence, which pitted an alliance between American settlers and the governments of France and Spain, the latter hoping to win back Florida against the English army, supported by German mercenaries. French soldiers fighting alongside the settlers gave the secessionists a decisive advantage. In 1783, a truce was signed in Paris. England had to accept the proclamation of the United States of America as an independent country. Florida was returned to Spain. England kept Canada. The rise of the USA. What did the class composition of the newly independent USA look like? The African population comprised about 20% of the country at the time, but the numbers varied widely between regions. In New England, people of African descent made up less than 3% of the population, in New York 14%. And in South Carolina 60%. The European settlers could roughly be divided into the following groups: 10% capitalists, plantation owners, and merchants. 20% big farmers and urban middle class, 40% small farmers, 10% craftsmen, 15% temporary workers, aiming to acquire land and become farmers, 5% workers. This meant that about 80% of the European settler population could be counted as members of the bourgeoisie and propertied petty bourgeoisie. Below the European settlers in the social hierarchy were slaves, the proletariat of low-waged Africans, and immigrants from Latin America and Asia. The European settlers formed, so to speak, the country's natural labor aristocracy. At the beginning of the 19th century, the U.S. economy was a reflection of the world economy. In England, the Industrial Revolution had unfolded against the background of colonialism. In the USA, industrialization unfolded against the background of internal colonialism, the oppression of the indigenous peoples, the exploitation of the proletariat, and, last but certainly not least, slavery. Slavery is often exclusively associated with the cotton and tobacco plantations of the American South. But long before the plantation economy blossomed in the mid-19th century, slavery was already an integral part of the North American economy. Dutch settlers had forced African slaves to work in construction and agriculture, and slaves were used across the country as domestic servants. In 1820, there were about 2 million slaves in the country. Their value has been estimated at over $1 billion, that is, about 20% of the total value owned by Americans at the time. Slavery was fully integrated into the capitalist economy. Both the slave trade and the plantation economy were highly lucrative businesses financed by a flourishing American banking and finance sector. Cotton was not only the most important good produced by slave labor, but was also the most important raw material for global capitalism. Economist Susan Grigsby, in 1860, the Southern slave labor camps provided 88% of the cotton used in Great Britain's cotton mills. Cotton went from 14% of the total American exports in 1802 to 61% by 1860. The United States share of the worldwide cotton market climbed from 1% in 1801 to 66% by 1860. The fact that the U.S. controlled the world market for cotton was a clear sign of the USA emerging as a new superpower in the capitalist world system. For the renowned African-American scholar W.E.B. Du Bois, capitalism implied racism. Cotton was produced by enslaved people on stolen land. The history of slavery and that of capitalism are inseparable. Capitalism has always exploited and reproduced notions of racial difference. In Black Reconstruction in America, published in 1935, Du Bois wrote, "Black labor became the foundation stone not only of the Southern social structure, but of Northern manufacture and commerce, of the English factory system, of European commerce, of buying and selling on a worldwide scale. New cities were built on the results of black labor, and a new labor problem, involving all white labor, arose in both Europe and America." For Du Bois, the black worker is subjected to both capital and white supremacy. In his analysis, the slave plantations of Mississippi, the financial and trading institutions of Manhattan, and the mills of Manchester all belonged to one and the same system. The history of the white working class is intrinsically tied to the privileges of whiteness. Du Bois wrote of wages of whiteness against the background of a global economy in which places such as Mississippi, Manhattan, and Manchester were tied together by white supremacy. While the white working class of the United States praised liberty and freedom, racist practices and laws were commonplace. Between 1790 and 1860, the population of the USA rose from 4 to 32 million people. Immigrants flocked to the newly independent country to start new, more prosperous lives. They settled all across the continent. There was a strong commitment to bring even the most remote areas under settler control. President Thomas Jefferson declared in 1801, "However our present interests may restrain us within our own limits, it is impossible not to look forward to distant times, when our rapid multiplication will expand itself beyond those limits and cover the whole northern, if not the southern continent, with a people speaking the same language, governed in similar form by similar laws." A few years later, this sentiment was made official in the Monroe Doctrine, which declared that the United States would defend all of the Americas against European influence. The unspoken implication was that the Americas would be controlled by the United States. Industry and agriculture. The USA's economic development during the 19th century was characterized by a surplus of land and a shortage of labor, especially skilled labor. Poorly paid workers could always go west and find land. This led to wages twice as high as those of England. In the second half of the 19th century, average wages in the USA were 50% higher than in Europe, even though most American workers were unskilled. Skilled European workers had little reason to emigrate, as they could find fairly well-paid work at home. The shortage of labor in the U.S. provided a strong incentive to develop labor-saving technology. The U.S. set new standards in replacing manual labor with machines, both in manufacturing and agriculture. State-of-the-art iron and steel plows were produced and sold by the thousands. The U.S. plows presented at the 1851 Great Exhibition in London were far superior to the ones produced in Europe. One of the most important innovations was the horse-drawn combine harvester. It had been invented in 1833 by Cyrus McCormick, a Scottish immigrant. His model was put to production in Chicago by the International Harvester Company, which remains an industry leader to this day. By 1855, more than 10,000 horse-drawn combines were in use in the USA. This solved the labor shortage that had been a particular problem during harvest season. The horse-drawn combine doubled the productivity of a laborer's work. Mechanical threshing machines and seed drills had already been introduced in the 1830s, at a time when they were virtually unknown in Europe. Such technological innovations led to industrial farming on the East Coast. Small farmers who could not adapt went bankrupt, many of them going west to start anew. The increase in agricultural productivity was one of the requirements for the USA's industrialization. Agricultural production in the U.S. was not only able to satisfy domestic needs, but could also deliver valuable goods for export. It allowed American industry to grow. But the transformation of agriculture also meant an end to self-reliance. Before the Industrial Revolution, the settlers produced most of what they needed themselves. Farming was combined with craft production. With the industrialization of agriculture, self-sufficiency was dying out. Even the small farmers remaining were now focusing exclusively on agricultural production, as it had become more profitable. As a consequence of the Industrial Revolution, many of the consumer goods formerly produced at home were now produced cheaper, and with more durable materials, in factories. Within a short time, agricultural workers became lucrative customers for both agricultural machinery and consumer goods. At first, English industry benefited from this, as it exported consumer goods to the U.S. But this would soon change, for two reasons. First, the American government introduced protectionist policies. Second, American industry quickly became very competitive. Paradoxically, this was a result of the shortage in skilled labor and of high wages. As in agriculture, American industrialists were forced to compensate for the shortage of labor with mechanical innovation. In the 1840s, the conveyor belt was introduced in slaughterhouses and the meat packing industry. Animals dangling from a crook moved from worker to worker. One of them cut open the carcass, another took out the heart, another cut off a leg, and so on, until all of the meat was salted and packed. The entire animal was used. The parts that could not be made into food were used to produce leather, soap, and candles. The conveyor belt soon spread to other industries. An arms manufacturer, Eli Whitney, introduced changeable standard parts in arms production. As the story goes, he had got a contract for the delivery of 10,000 guns to the government. At the time, each gun was made from parts individually produced by a gunsmith. Whitney could not find enough skilled gunsmiths to process the government order in time, so he developed machines that produced standardized gun parts with such accuracy that they could be assembled by unskilled workers. This is a prime example of machinery replacing manual labor. Standardized parts were soon widespread in the production of locks, clocks, sewing machines, typewriters, and agricultural tools. Craftsmanship was replaced by mass production. One of the first mass-produced consumer goods was the iron stove. In the 1850s, more than 1 million of them came out of U.S. factories. Furniture was now mass-produced, too, the furniture market having become very lucrative since more and more people flocked to the big cities and were in need of housing. Mass production had been made possible not only by technological innovation but also by an ever more effective organization of production. James Bonsack invented a cigarette rolling machine that could produce 120,000 cigarettes a day. It was put to use by the American Tobacco Company, which soon came to dominate the entire industry. Mechanization and labor-saving technology were central factors for the rise of U.S. industry and capital. But there were also others. The domestic market grew and made mass production profitable. The consolidation of the federal government meant the abolition of customs and tariffs in interstate trade. The government invested enormously in the country's infrastructure, building roads, railways, and canals, and, finally, a common currency was introduced. Before the end of the 19th century, industrial productivity in the U.S. was higher than in the birthplace of capitalism, England. The domestic market had strong purchasing power. The stage was set for a capitalist superpower to show its might. Slaves, immigrants, and imperialism. The profit rates of U.S. capital were secured by the exploitation of both an internal and an external proletariat. Until World War II, the European colonization of Asia and Africa stood in the way of the U.S. trading with Asian and African countries. The U.S. focused on trade within the Americas and the Caribbean instead. There, despite having to compete with England and Spain, they soon dominated the market. The Spanish Empire was crumbling. In the Spanish-American War of 1898, the U.S. conquered Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines. Due to liberation movements led by the national bourgeoisies, Spain had already lost control over the territories before they officially passed to the U.S. Now, these movements caused bigger problems for the Americans than the Spanish did. This was particularly true in the Philippines, where a bourgeois national revolution had ousted the Spanish colonizers. The U.S. had to ship more than half of its troops, 1.2 million soldiers, to the country in order to defeat the independence movement in a brutal war that lasted over 3 years and in which up to 1 million Filipinos lost their lives. Just as various European governments divided Africa between themselves, the U.S. periphery was now no longer limited to the Americas but spread far into the Pacific Ocean. During the colonization of the Philippines, U.S. generals built on the experiences of crushing indigenous resistance during the colonization of North America. In the so-called Indian Wars, the American military developed counterinsurgency tactics aimed at destroying the very fabric of indigenous life and culture. The same methods were now employed in the Philippines. The military apparatus of settler colonialism became a tool of imperialism. It was used throughout the 20th century in numerous foreign interventions by the U.S. military, now the most powerful in the world. Among other things, this allowed for the ongoing exploitation of an external proletariat. The internal proletariat of the USA had grown significantly in the 19th century. Between 1830 and 1860, 4.5 million new immigrants arrived in the country. Two-thirds of them were Irish or German. Most of them had belonged to Europe's reserve army of labor. For many Europeans, times were hard during the Industrial Revolution. In Ireland, there was widespread unemployment and the devastating famine of the late 1840s. The booming U.S. economy put pressure on Europe. The new Irish, German, Italian, and Polish proletarians were put to work in factories alongside Black, Latino, and Asian colleagues. The privileged positions of skilled laborers and foremen were largely reserved for the Anglo-Saxon settlers. They received the highest working wages, not just in the U.S., but in the world. Slavery was abolished in 1865, but freed slaves faced deep racial hostility. Racial hierarchies did not simply disappear with the institution of slavery. Black workers were seen as competitors and faced racism and violent attacks by white workers. Whiteness became an asset for recent European immigrants, a kind of symbolic capital. It promised better wages and working conditions. At the beginning of the 20th century, the American working class was sharply divided into three tiers. At the top was the Euro-American labor aristocracy, a privileged layer of skilled workers that constituted about 25% of the industrial working class, had a monopoly on the best-paid jobs, and was organized in the American Federation of Labor, AFL. One step below were the recent immigrants from Europe, who made up 75% of the industrial working class, resided in the big northern cities, were unskilled, poorly paid, and excluded from the trade unions and better jobs. At the bottom was the colonial proletariat of Africans, Latinos, and Asians. They did the hardest work for the lowest pay, whether it was in factories or mines, on fields or construction sites, or along the railways. The cotton industry in the South, which had always played a central role for the U.S. economy, was largely based on African American labor. Cotton production tripled between 1870 and 1910, accounting for 25% of total U.S. exports. African American labor was also essential for the coal mines of Alabama and the country's iron and steel industry. In the Southwest, Mexicans, Asians, and Native Americans worked in agriculture, on cattle and sheep farms, in mines, on the railroad, and in the urban service industry. The workers at the bottom of the labor hierarchy earned about $4 a week. The industrial workers who had recently arrived from Europe earned $6 to $10 a week. Members of the labor aristocracy earned $15 to $20 a week. One of the reasons for these comparatively high wages was the exploitation of an internal proletariat that ranked lower than the labor aristocracy. This did not exist in Europe in the same way. After gaining their independence from England, the settlers in the U.S. managed to establish a strong national economy, transforming North America from a periphery within the world capitalist system into its new center. In the early 20th century, the U.S. had all the requirements for rapid capitalist development: a big domestic market, strong purchasing power, and high industrial profits. The constant flow of value that was required to maintain protectionist policies and a white national labor aristocracy was secured by the privatization of the indigenous people's commons, the exploitation of an internal proletariat, formerly, of slaves, and imperialist policies in the West Indies, and Central and South America, and in the Pacific region. The transformation of the U.S. from colony to imperial superpower marked an overall shift in the power structure of global capitalism. Between 1860 and 1913, the world's industrial production grew sevenfold. In England it tripled, in France it quadrupled, in Germany it grew sevenfold, and in the U.S. 12-fold. The days of England being the world's industrial powerhouse were over.